The fog rolled in thick that night, a heavy choking mist that swallowed the narrow streets of Whitechapel whole. Gas lamps flickered weakly through the haze, casting long trembling shadows over cobblestones slick with rain and filth. The sound of horse hooves echoed in the distance, the faint clatter swallowed by the hum of the restless city. London, 1888. A city divided, wealth and grandeur in the west, misery and madness in the east. And it was in the east, in the slums of Whitechapel, where something unspeakable was about to awaken. Inside a cramped lodging house, a woman wrapped a torn shawl around her shoulders. Her name was Marian Nichols, though everyone called her Polly. She was tired, hungry, and desperate. She had no money for a bed that night, so she stepped into the fog, hoping to earn a few pence on the streets before dawn. No one would ever see her alive again. The Whitechapel district was alive with murmurs and menace. Men stumbled drunkenly from pubs. Factory smoke drifted down from chimneys. The air itself seemed to pulse with something sinister. But there was another presence that night, something unseen, moving silently through the mist, watching. A figure in the dark. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. The sound of leather boots on whetstone. Then silence. At 3:40 a.m., a carman named Charles Cross turned into Buck's Row. His lantern light wavered, catching something on the ground ahead. He stopped. It looked like a bundle of cloth, maybe rags. He moved closer. It wasn't rags, it was a woman's body. The mutilation was unlike anything London had ever seen. Within minutes, the street filled with policemen, neighbors, onlookers. None of them could believe what they were seeing. A killer had struck, not for money, not for revenge, but for something darker. As the body was carried away, a whisper spread through the crowd. A whisper that would soon become a roar across all of England. He's out there. Someone's killing the women of Whitechapel. By morning, the news had reached every corner of London. The newspapers ran wild. Horrible murder in Whitechapel, screamed the headlines. The public devoured every word, every rumor, every gruesome detail. And in that frenzy of fear and fascination, a legend was born. But this was no myth. The killer was real, and he was only getting started. 2 nights later, a constable patrolled the same streets, his eyes scanning the fog for any sign of danger. He passed dark alleys, doorways, and the silhouettes of the desperate. The people of Whitechapel had grown used to fear. But even they could not imagine the nightmare that was about to unfold. Behind him, unseen, a shadow moved. No one saw his face. No one heard him speak, but they would come to know his name. He didn't just kill. He mutilated methodically, almost surgically. His victims were women living on the edge of society, unseen by the world, until he made them famous in death. Each murder grew more brutal, more shocking, as if the killer was feeding off the terror he created. The police were clueless. Scotland Yard was overwhelmed, and London was bleeding. The killer had no pattern, no clear motive, no mercy. He struck in silence, disappeared into the mist, and left behind a city trembling in horror. But there was one thing he never left behind: himself. They called him by many names: the monster of Whitechapel, the fiend, the East End butcher. But it was a letter, written in blood-red ink and delivered to a newspaper, that gave him his eternal title. The letter began, "Dear Boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they want to fix me just yet." It was signed with a name that would echo through the centuries: Jack the Ripper. From that moment, the line between truth and nightmare vanished. The Ripper wasn't just a killer anymore. He was a symbol of terror itself. Women stopped walking alone. The pubs emptied early. Policemen doubled their patrols. And yet, every foggy night, people claimed to hear the faint click of boots in the dark. And they froze, wondering if he was there, right behind them. Whitechapel had become a hunting ground. And Jack the Ripper was his predator. As September dawned, another body was about to be found, and the city's descent into madness was far from over. The sun had barely risen over London on the morning of September 8, 1888, When the people of Whitechapel awoke to another horror, darker, crueler, and far more calculated than before. The streets were damp from a night of fog and drizzle, and the alleys smelled of stale beer, soot, and despair. But nothing in those familiar smells could prepare the city for what they were about to discover. Just after 6 o'clock that morning, a market porter named John Davis stepped out of his room at 29 Hanbury Street, heading toward the yard. The dawn light was faint, gray, and uncertain. He pushed open the back door and froze. There, lying near the steps, was a woman's body. Her name was Annie Chapman, a 47-year-old woman who had lived a life of quiet suffering. Once married, once a mother, she had fallen into poverty after her husband's death. Like many women of the East End, she was forgotten by the world long before her murder would make her infamous. But this was not just a killing. This was something else, something ritualistic, something deliberate. Her throat had been cut deep, precise, almost surgical. Her abdomen had been ripped open, and parts of her internal organs were missing. Whoever did this hadn't acted in rage or panic. He had worked with control and time. When the police arrived, they were stunned by the brutality. Inspector Joseph Chandler immediately called for Scotland Yard. The crime scene drew curious onlookers from every direction, their whispers filling the street like a tide of dread. Another woman just like the last, they murmured. Panic began to take root in Whitechapel. The people of the East End were no strangers to violence, but this was different. This was methodical, evil. It felt as though a dark intelligence was stalking the streets, hunting at will and mocking those who tried to stop him. The press swarmed like vultures. By noon, every newspaper in London was running with lurid headlines. Another horrible murder in Whitechapel. The fiend strikes again. A demon in human form. The public was fascinated and terrified. The killings were gruesome, yes, but they also carried a strange allure, a mystery that seemed almost supernatural. How could a killer vanish so easily in a city full of eyes? And yet, despite the horror, there was order, even beauty, in his cruelty. Each murder was carefully staged. Each cut, each position of the body seemed intentional. The police began to suspect they were dealing not with a common murderer, but someone who understood anatomy, perhaps a butcher, perhaps a medical man. At Scotland Yard, the investigation grew desperate. Detectives worked by candlelight, their desks piled high with reports, witness statements, and sketches. Constables were sent into every alley, every pub, every lodging house. But Whitechapel was a labyrinth, an endless maze of poverty and pain. People vanished there every day. Witnesses came forward, but their stories only deepened the confusion. Some said they'd seen a man with a black bag, others claimed he wore a deerstalker hat, and still others swore he looked like a foreigner. But all agreed on one thing: he moved like a ghost. Meanwhile, the coroner's inquest for Annie Chapman sent shockwaves through London. The surgeon's testimony confirmed what many feared: the killer had removed organs with skill and precision. That revelation changed everything. The idea of a madman was horrifying enough. But the idea of a calculated killer, perhaps even a doctor, dissecting his victims in the shadows, that was beyond comprehension. Soon, the rumors grew louder. Was he a failed medical student? A lunatic escaped from an asylum? A member of the upper class, preying on the poor for twisted pleasure? Fear turned to paranoia. The working women of Whitechapel refused to walk the streets alone. Mothers locked their daughters indoors after dark. Even the hardened men of the district began to keep their knives close and their eyes sharper than ever before. And still, the killer watched. Some nights, the fog would roll in thicker than usual, wrapping the streets in a suffocating blanket. The gas lamps burned low, and the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere, behind the veil of mist, boots echoed on cobblestones. The Ripper, though the name had not yet become legend, was preparing. He was studying his next victim, learning her routines, her fears, her vulnerabilities. Every murder wasn't just an act of violence. It was a performance, A message. A game he was winning, and the entire city was his stage. Within weeks, the killings would escalate. The mutilations would grow more grotesque. And London would descend into full-blown hysteria because the monster of Whitechapel wasn't finished. He was only just beginning. By the end of September 1888, fear had grown into obsession. Every newspaper headline, every whispered conversation, every shadow on a foggy night revolved around one name, the Whitechapel murderer. Though the press had not yet coined the infamous moniker Jack the Ripper, his legend was already taking form. London had turned into a city holding its breath. But nothing, not the sleepless constables, not the curfews, not even the rising terror, could prepare them for the horrors of September 30th, 1888, a night that would be remembered as the double event. It was late, just past 1 a.m. The fog was thick and heavy, rolling through the East End like a living thing. The gas lamps flickered weakly, their light dissolving in the mist. In Berners Street, a woman named Elizabeth Stride stood near the entrance to a dark yard behind a socialist club. She was 45, quiet, and known among the others as Long Liz. Like the Ripper's previous victims, she was poor, often homeless, and struggling to survive. But unlike the others, she carried herself with a touch of grace, a remnant of better days long past. That night, witnesses later recalled seeing her with a man, dark-haired, respectably dressed, perhaps foreign. They argued quietly. Then, suddenly, a passerby noticed Stride's body lying on the ground. Her throat had been cut, but there was something strange. There were no further mutilations. The killer had been interrupted. A cart pulled by a horse had entered the narrow street, scaring him away before he could finish his grim work. The constables were alerted quickly. Whistles blew, boots echoed, orders were shouted. But by the time the police began to search the area, the killer had vanished into the fog. Or so they thought. Because less than an hour later, barely half a mile away, he struck again. At Mitre Square, a dark, deserted corner near Aldgate, Catherine Eddowes was found. Her death was savage, far beyond anything London had seen. Her face was slashed, her throat cut to the spine, and her body mutilated with chilling precision. The killer had finished what he couldn't in Berners Street. 2 murders in one night. 2 scenes of unimaginable horror. A message written in blood. When police arrived at Mitre Square, the air was still thick with fog and iron from the fresh blood. Inspector Edward Collard and Dr. Frederick Gordon Brown examined the body under the flicker of lantern light. The cuts were so methodical that one officer whispered, "He works like a surgeon." A portion of the victim's organs had been removed and taken. The killer was evolving, growing bolder, faster, more confident. He had slaughtered 2 women in under an hour and escaped into the night unseen. As dawn broke, word of the double event spread like wildfire through London. Newspapers printed special editions before breakfast, their front pages screaming, "2 more women murdered. The monster strikes twice in one night." Whitechapel descended into chaos. Crowds gathered outside police stations demanding protection. The working poor, who had long been ignored by the city as elite, suddenly became the focus of every reporter in Britain. And then came something no one expected. Later that day, at the Central News Agency, an envelope arrived. Inside was a letter, written in red ink, addressed to the police. It began, "Dear Boss." The letter mocked the authorities, describing details of the murders that had not been made public. It ended with a chilling signature, "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." It was the moment the killer gave himself a name that would echo through history. As panic consumed London, the police grew desperate. Dozens of suspects were rounded up, but none fit. One theory suggested a foreign sailor. Another proposed a butcher. A few even whispered of a doctor with a dark obsession. Detectives worked through the night, studying maps, comparing the timing of murders, trying to find a pattern. But the Ripper was too clever. He moved like smoke, appearing and vanishing between the labyrinthine alleys of Whitechapel. And then there was the clue. Near the site of the second murder, an officer found a piece of bloody cloth in a doorway at Goulston Street, believed to belong to Catherine Eddowes. Above it, scrawled in chalk, were the words, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Was it a message from the killer? A red herring? Or simply graffiti from someone else entirely? The debate raged for years. But the message only deepened the fear. The police commissioner, Sir Charles Warren, ordered it erased before the sun rose, terrified it might spark anti-Semitic riots in an already volatile district. And so, one of the only potential clues left by the Ripper was wiped from existence. That night, the city didn't sleep. Every flickering light, every distant step on cobblestones, felt like the whisper of death. For the first time, even Scotland Yard admitted they were dealing with something beyond comprehension, not just a murderer but a phantom. A mind as brilliant as it was deranged. Women refused to walk the streets, men carried clubs. And still, in the thick fog, one figure moved unseen, calm, methodical, unstoppable. The Ripper had declared war on London, and London was losing. By early October 1888, London was drowning in fear. The air over Whitechapel was heavy, not just with the smell of coal smoke and rotting refuse, but with panic. Women no longer dared to walk alone. Policemen patrolled in pairs. And yet, despite every effort, Jack the Ripper, now named and feared by all, seemed to vanish into the fog after each kill, like a phantom born of the night. But just when the city thought it had seen the worst of him, he spoke. It began with an envelope, small, cheap, spattered with something dark. On October 16, 1888, it was delivered to George Lusk, the chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, a local group of men who had taken it upon themselves to patrol the streets after dark. The letter was crudely written, the handwriting jagged and uneven, almost childlike. It began simply, "From hell." Inside the envelope was something else, a small cardboard box wrapped in brown paper. Lusk opened it carefully, surrounded by his fellow committee members. What they saw turned their blood cold. Inside the box was half of a human kidney preserved in spirits. The letter continued, "Mr. Lusk, sir, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman. Preserved it for you, t'other piece I fried and ate it. It was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out if you only wait a while longer. Signed, Catch Me When You Can, Jack the Ripper." For a moment, no one spoke. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of a wall clock. Then one of the men swore, another backed away, pale and shaking. Lusk himself, a tough, practical man, turned ashen. Was it real? Had the killer truly written to them and sent part of his victim as proof? The kidney was examined by Dr. Thomas Openshaw at the London hospital. His findings were horrifying. It was indeed a human kidney from the left side and likely belonged to a woman in her 40s who suffered from Bright's disease. That matched the autopsy report of Catherine Eddowes, the Ripper's fourth victim. The evidence was undeniable. The Ripper had not only killed, he had taunted. The press exploded. Every newspaper across Britain screamed the story in enormous black headlines. "Letter from Hell. The monster mocks London. Human remains sent to Vigilance Committee." Panic turned to hysteria. Women fainted at the newsstands. Men began to suspect their own neighbors. Rumors ran wild that the killer was a butcher, a surgeon, even a member of the royal family. Detectives worked without rest, tracing every letter, every witness, every whisper, but they were chasing shadows. And as London plunged deeper into fear, the Ripper's legend grew darker. Meanwhile, in the back alleys of Whitechapel, the vigilantes took matters into their own hands. And through it all, the real killer, calm, patient, invisible, moved unseen among them. He had turned the entire city into his hunting ground. Inside Scotland Yard, frustration was boiling over. Detectives Frederick Aberline and Robert Anderson argued bitterly about suspects. The press accused the police of incompetence. One paper even suggested that, Jack the Ripper was a member of the police force itself. Then came another letter, this one written in neat, deliberate handwriting, signed the same way, "Dear Boss." It repeated details only the killer could know. The letters, the kidney, the precision of the murders, all pointed to one conclusion. This man wasn't killing for money or revenge. He was killing for pleasure, for the thrill, for the fear it caused. He wanted to be seen, to be known, to be remembered. And through his letters he was. By late October, the streets of Whitechapel were patrolled every hour of the night. Police whistles echoed through the fog like haunting cries. The Ripper had turned the East End into a fortress, but it didn't matter. He had already won. He didn't need to kill again to make London tremble. He just needed to write. In his final lines, the Ripper had dared the city. "Catch me when you can." It was a challenge, not just to the police but to history itself, and to this day, London never did. That night, George Lusk locked his doors, double-bolted his windows, and kept a revolver under his pillow. He didn't sleep. Because somewhere, out there in the misty streets, a man was laughing. A man who had turned murder into myth. A man who had written from hell itself. By November 1888, London was drowning in dread. The fog rolled thick through the narrow streets of Whitechapel, muffling footsteps, swallowing voices, and turning every flickering gaslight into a ghostly blur. The Ripper had been silent for weeks. No bodies, no blood, no letters. People began to whisper that he was gone, that maybe the police had caught him in secret, that maybe he was dead. But those who truly understood his nature knew better. The Ripper wasn't gone. He was waiting. And what came next would be his final masterpiece of horror. The calm before the slaughter. It was the night of November 8, 1888. In a cramped little room at 13 Miller's Court, a woman named Mary Jane Kelly sat by a dying fire. She was young, just 25, far younger than the Ripper's previous victims. Unlike the others, she wasn't sleeping on the streets. She had her own room, one single lonely room, where she lived, loved, and dreamed of escaping the shadows of Whitechapel. Outside, the rain was falling in thin silver sheets. A man's voice was heard at her door sometime after midnight. Neighbors would later say they heard laughter. And then singing. Mary's voice, soft but haunting, drifted through the thin walls. "Only a violet I plucked from my mother's grave." It was her last song. The discovery at dawn, the light crept weakly into Miller's Court. A young rent collector named Thomas Bowyer knocked at Mary's door, sent by her landlord to collect overdue rent. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. Then he stepped closer and saw it. The small window beside the door had a broken pane stuffed with rags. Curious, he pulled them away and peered inside. What he saw made him stagger back in horror. On the narrow bed, in a room painted red, lay what was once Mary Jane Kelly. Her body was so mutilated that at first he thought there were two people inside. The walls, the sheets, the floor, everything was soaked in blood. Her face was destroyed beyond recognition. He ran screaming to the police station. The scene of hell when Inspector Frederick Aberline arrived. Even the veteran officers refused to enter. Some covered their mouths. One fainted. It took Aberline's iron will to force himself through the doorway. What he found has haunted police files ever since. Mary Kelly had been butchered, her throat cut down to the spine. Her organs removed, arranged, almost displayed upon a small table by the bed. Her heart was missing. And yet, despite the savagery, nothing in the room had been stolen. Her clothes, a few coins, a pair of boots, all untouched. This was not robbery. This was ritual. The killer had taken his time. Hours, perhaps. Behind a locked door, with no one to disturb him, Jack the Ripper had performed his grand finale. The search for a ghost, the city erupted. The newspapers screamed again. The most horrible murder yet. Whitechapel monster strikes again. Detectives flooded Miller's Court, searching every inch for clues. a bloody handprint on the wall, a burnt piece of women's clothing in the fireplace, a leather apron. But none of it led anywhere. Witnesses came forward. A neighbor heard footsteps. Another saw a man with a dark coat and a peaked hat walking calmly away at dawn. But the fog had swallowed all certainty. Aberline worked day and night, piecing together fragments of horror. Every theory was explored, from surgeons to sailors, butchers to aristocrats. But in the end, they found nothing. The killer had vanished, as if London's fog itself had swallowed him whole. The silence that followed after Mary Jane Kelly's death. The killings stopped. The Ripper, who had terrorized London for months, mocked the police, written letters from hell, and turned murder into myth, was suddenly silent. No more bodies. No more taunts. No more shadow in the fog. It was as if he had completed his work, his masterpiece of fear, and disappeared into history. The aftermath, the people of Whitechapel never recovered. The Ripper's reign had left scars that could not heal. Prostitutes vanished from the streets. Fear turned neighbors into enemies. And for years afterward, every new murder in London carried the same whispered question: is he back? Detective Aberline continued to hunt clues for years, haunted by the case he could never solve. He once said quietly to a colleague, "We weren't chasing a man. We were chasing a nightmare." Legacy of the Ripper. Over a century later, we still don't know who he was. Theories abound: a doctor, a butcher, a prince, a painter, even a member of Scotland Yard itself. But one fact remains unshaken. Jack the Ripper changed history. He gave birth to the modern idea of a serial killer. He turned murder into legend. And his name, whispered through the ages, still has the power to chill the blood. Epilogue: in the quiet of dawn, the fog still drifts through Whitechapel's narrow lanes. The gaslights flicker, the cobblestones glisten wet with rain. Some say if you walk there alone, past Dorset Street, past Miller's Court, and listen closely, you can still hear a woman's faint song echoing through the mist. Only a violet I plucked from my mother's grave. And somewhere, hidden in the darkness, a shadow watches, smiling. The legend of Jack the Ripper never truly died. After the blood dried in Miller's Court, London was left with one haunting question: who was Jack the Ripper? The murders had ended, but the mystery had just begun. Every detective, journalist, and curious citizen became obsessed with unmasking the phantom who had terrorized Whitechapel. What emerged over the next century was a labyrinth of theories, filled with deception, obsession, and shadows, because every clue seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere. The impossible investigation. The year was 1888, and forensic science was in its infancy. There were no fingerprints, no DNA testing, no modern forensics, just candlelight, intuition, and fear. Witnesses were unreliable, most too terrified or too drunk to remember what they saw. The killer's hunting ground, the slums of Whitechapel, was a maze of dark alleys and hidden passageways. The police had names, dozens of them, but they all slipped through their fingers. Still, a few stood out, men whose lives, habits, and secrets made them more than just suspects. The butcher, Aaron Kosminski. The first serious suspect was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish Jewish barber living in Whitechapel. He was poor, paranoid, and known to have violent tendencies. Neighbors claimed he heard voices. He hated women, especially prostitutes. Police files describe him as a man with strong homicidal tendencies and hatred of women. Kosminski was eventually admitted to an asylum, where he spent the rest of his life in silence. Years later, Scotland Yard officials would whisper that he was the one. But there was no proof, no weapon, no confession. And the killings continued for a short time even after his interment, casting doubt on the theory. Still, for many investigators, Kosminski remains the leading suspect. A madman in the fog. The doctor, Montague John Druitt. Then came Montague John Druitt, a respectable barrister and teacher from a good family. He vanished shortly after Mary Jane Kelly's murder. A month later, his body was found floating in the River Thames. Police officials, including Chief Constable Melville McNaughton, later listed him as a prime suspect, claiming he was sexually insane and that the Whitechapel murders ceased after his death. But there was no direct evidence. Druitt didn't live in Whitechapel, had no known connection to the victims, and no witness ever described a man of his appearance. Still, to many, the timing of his death was too perfect to ignore. A troubled man, possibly tormented by his crimes, ending his own life after his final, most brutal act. The surgeon, Dr. Thomas Neil Cream. There was also Dr. Thomas Neil Cream, a physician, and a killer. Before Jack the Ripper's murders, Cream had already poisoned several women. He was caught, imprisoned, and released in 1891, years after the Ripper murders. But when he was hanged, witnesses claimed his final words were, "I am Jack the..." The executioner pulled the lever before he could finish. It was the perfect cliffhanger, the kind that still haunts historians. Could Cream have been the Ripper? Unlikely, given his imprisonment at the time of the killings. But in the mythology of the case, even the impossible finds believers. The artist, Walter Sickert, the famous painter Walter Sickert, had a fascination with the murders. He painted haunting images of dark rooms, blood, and women sprawled across beds, eerily similar to the Ripper's victims. Author Patricia Cornwell, in modern times, spent millions investigating him. She even claimed to have found DNA evidence linking him to one of the Ripper letters. But the evidence was inconclusive. Many experts argued that Sickert was merely obsessed with the case, not part of it. Still, his art remains unsettlingly close to the truth, almost as if he'd seen the crime scenes firsthand. Coincidence? Or confession in paint? The royal conspiracy, the prince and the painter no Ripper theory has captivated the public more than the royal conspiracy. It begins with whispers that Prince Albert Victor, grandson of Queen Victoria, had fallen in love with a commoner, a shopgirl named Annie Crook. When the royal family discovered the affair, a secret cover-up was launched. The story claims that several prostitutes knew of the secret marriage and were silenced. The assassin? The Queen's physician, Sir William Gull. He supposedly killed the women to protect the crown while the royal family ensured the story never reached the press. It's a story fit for a movie, and many have made it one. But historians dismiss it as fantasy. The writer's theory, the shadow of the press. Another theory points to the journalists themselves. At the time, newspapers were locked in fierce competition. Circulation exploded during the Ripper murders. The more gruesome the story, the more papers sold. What if Jack the Ripper wasn't just a killer, but a creation? Some theorists suggest that the murders were exaggerated, manipulated, even staged, to keep the story alive. After all, the Dear Boss letters that coined the name Jack the Ripper came from an anonymous writer who was never caught. Could it have been someone from the press, inventing the legend for headlines? The unthinkable theory. The woman, one of the strangest theories, proposes that Jack the Ripper was not a man at all, but a woman, known in whispers as Jill the Ripper. This theory emerged from the fact that a woman could have easily walked the Whitechapel streets without suspicion. She could have lured the victims, even disguised the aftermath. Some point to Mary Piercy, a woman later executed for murder, who bore striking similarities in method and madness. Could the ultimate killer have hidden behind society's blindness, using her gender as camouflage? The DNA revelation in 2014, modern science made its boldest claim. Researchers examined a bloodstained shawl allegedly found near Catherine Eddowes' body. Using mitochondrial DNA, they linked it to a descendant of Aaron Kosminski, the Mad Barber. Headlines exploded. Jack the Ripper identified. But soon after, experts questioned the results. The evidence chain was broken. The shawl's origin was unclear. Even the testing methods were disputed. In the end, the mystery survived, untouched. The truth beneath the fog. The truth, it seems, lies not in the identity of the killer, but in his shadow. Whoever Jack the Ripper was, He exploited a society that didn't care about its poor, its women, or its forgotten. He thrived in darkness, not just the physical fog of London, but the moral fog of neglect. He was one man, yes, but also something larger. A reflection of everything Victorian London tried to hide, and maybe that's why we'll never find him. Because the Ripper wasn't just a killer. He was a symptom, a mirror, a legend born from fear. By the autumn of 1888, the people of London were no longer just terrified, they were obsessed. The fog-choked streets of Whitechapel were alive with whispers. And in the heart of that fear, a new terror emerged: letters. Messages written in blood-red ink, sent straight to the very people trying to catch the monster. The killer had found his voice, and he wanted the world to hear it. The first letter: Dear Boss. On September 25, 1888, a letter arrived at the Central News Agency, written in red ink. The handwriting was uneven, hurried, but chillingly confident. It began simply, Dear Boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. The tone was mocking, playful even. And then came the line that would forever change history. The next job I do, I shall clip the lady's ears off and send to the police officers just for jolly. The letter was signed, Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. It was the first time the name appeared. The name that would go on to haunt the world for over a century. At first, Scotland Yard dismissed it as a hoax, another sick prank in a city full of gossip. But then, on September 30th, 2 women were killed in one night. One of them, Catherine Eddowes, had her ear cut, exactly as the letter had promised. Suddenly, the police weren't laughing anymore. The letter's prophecy had come true. The second message, the Saucy Jackie postcard. Just 2 days later, another message arrived at the Central News Agency. This time it was a postcard, shorter, cruder, but unmistakably from the same hand. I was not codding dear old boss when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow. Double event this time. The double event, the 2 murders on the same night, had already taken place. How could anyone but the killer know such details so quickly? The timing was perfect. The handwriting, the tone, identical. Police were forced to consider the unthinkable. Jack the Ripper was writing to them, taunting them. These weren't just murders anymore. It was a psychological war. The killer wasn't hiding. He was performing. And London was his stage. The From Hell letter, the most chilling of all weeks later. On October 16, 1888, another letter arrived, this one unlike any before. It was delivered to George Lusk, the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, a group of citizens helping police patrol the streets. The envelope was cheap, stained, and inside was a piece of paper scrawled in broken English. It read, From Hell, Mr. Lusk. Sir, I sent you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you. The other piece I fried and ate, it was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out, if you only wait a while longer. Signed, Catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk. Enclosed with the letter was a small piece of human kidney, carefully wrapped in tissue paper. Doctors confirmed it was real, from a woman, possibly one of the victims. The shock was immediate. Newspapers printed the story, and London exploded in horror. Crowds gathered outside police stations. Parents locked their doors. The fog itself seemed thicker, darker, more alive. Had Jack the Ripper truly sent a piece of his victim? Or was it another cruel prank? To this day, no one knows. But the handwriting, the content, and the macabre trophy made this the most infamous letter in criminal history, the one that gave the Ripper an inhuman edge, turning him into something more than a man, something almost supernatural, a killer or a copycat. Not everyone believed the letters were real. Even in 1888, the police suspected that many of them, perhaps all, were hoaxes. By the end of that year, over 600 letters claiming to be from Jack the Ripper had flooded Scotland Yard and newspaper offices. Most were crude imitations, but a few felt different. The Dear Boss letter, the saucy Jackie postcard, and the From Hell note, these three stood apart. Their timing, their details, their tone. Too precise to ignore. Too convincing to dismiss. But who wrote them? If not the Ripper himself, then who would dare mock a city in mourning? Some suspected journalists, eager to keep the story alive. After all, every new Ripper headline sold thousands of papers. One theory suggests that Tom Bulling, a journalist from the Central News Agency, may have fabricated the letters to maintain public interest. If true, it means the name Jack the Ripper, one of history's most feared killers, may have been born from a journalist's pen, not a murderer's knife. The power of a name. Before the letters, he was just the Whitechapel murderer. After them, he became something far more terrifying. Jack the Ripper, short, sharp, unforgettable. It gave the faceless killer an identity. It gave fear a voice. The name itself became his most powerful weapon, spreading terror across oceans and generations. The man may have vanished, but his legend became immortal. This was no longer about solving crimes. It was about controlling the narrative of evil. Even the police began to realize they weren't chasing a man anymore. They were chasing a myth. The city in fear. By late 1888, London had become a city under siege by its own imagination. Any dark shape in the fog, any hurried footsteps behind, any shadow on the wall, could be him. Rumors spread that Jack had been seen near schools, churches, even royal residences. Every stranger was suspect. Every woman was potential prey. The fear was so thick, it changed London itself, its laws, its policing, its press. The Ripper's letters didn't just mock the system, they reshaped it. And in doing so, they turned the killer into a cultural phenomenon. Jack wasn't just murdering women. He was murdering the city's sense of safety. The letters that never stopped even after the murders ended, the letters kept coming. Year after year, new messages appeared, from different countries, different hands, all claiming to be from Jack the Ripper. Some came decades later, long after the killer was dust and legend. Each one reigniting the same fear, the same fascination. It was as if the letters had taken on a life of their own, a ghostly echo that refused to fade. The ink has long since dried, the paper has yellowed. But somewhere, perhaps, in the dim archives of Scotland Yard, those letters still rest, a chilling whisper from the past. And when you read them, you can almost hear his laughter drifting through the fog. Catch me if you can. The year was drawing to a close, 1888, the autumn of terror. But for the people of Whitechapel, time had lost all meaning. Daylight offered no comfort, and nightfall brought only dread. The name Jack the Ripper had become a curse whispered behind closed doors, a living nightmare that no one could wake from. A city in shadow, every corner of London's East End trembled with fear. The narrow cobblestone streets, once filled with laughter, vendors, and children, had turned into corridors of suspicion. Women hurried home before dark, clutching shawls tied around their shoulders. Men walked in groups, eyes darting at every sound. Even the gas lamps seemed to flicker with unease, their pale glow revealing more fog than light. The Ripper had done more than kill. He had stolen the city's soul. A broken trust. The people no longer trusted the police. Scotland Yard, once a symbol of British order, was now the target of anger and ridicule. Detectives were mocked in newspapers for their failures. Politicians demanded answers. Ordinary citizens formed vigilance committees, patrolling the streets with sticks and lanterns. The most famous of them was George Lusk's Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, a group of tradesmen who had taken justice into their own hands. But even their nightly patrols couldn't restore calm, because no one knew who the killer was, and worse, he could be anyone. A neighbor, a doctor, a priest, a policeman. Anyone who vanished into the fog at night could be him. The suspects multiplied. As fear grew, so did suspicion. Everyone had their theory. Some believed the Ripper was a butcher or surgeon, skilled with a knife. Others swore he was a foreigner, perhaps a sailor or immigrant, hiding among the poor. The newspapers fanned the flames, printing wild stories that turned paranoia into hysteria. And the list of suspects grew longer by the day. There was Montague John Druitt, a troubled schoolteacher who disappeared soon after the final murder. There was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish barber known to suffer mental illness. Michael Ostrog, a conman and thief with a violent past. And Dr. Thomas Neil Cream, a poisoner who once whispered, "I am Jack the," before being hanged. Each man fit parts of the puzzle. Yet none completed it. The police under pressure behind the walls of Scotland Yard, panic was rising too. Detective Inspector Frederick Aberlin, a veteran officer, worked tirelessly, studying crime scene photos, interrogating witnesses, and walking the foggy alleys of Whitechapel himself. He knew the killer's pattern, the streets he hunted, the times he struck. But the Ripper was always one step ahead. The problem wasn't a lack of clues. It was too many of them. Too many false leads, false confessions, and fabricated letters. Every night the press demanded answers. Every morning the public demanded justice, but Aberline had neither. In private, even he began to wonder, was this man of flesh and blood? Or something darker? The press turns the knife. London's newspapers became the Ripper's most powerful accomplice. Headlines screamed across every front page. Another horrible murder. The fiend of Whitechapel strikes again. For the first time, crime had become entertainment. Reporters crowded the slums, bribing witnesses for details, and artists drew gruesome sketches of the bodies. The public couldn't look away. The terror had become addictive. Every issue sold faster than the last. And with each sale, the legend of Jack the Ripper grew stronger. Some historians later said, the Ripper didn't just kill 5 women. He killed Victorian innocents. Women in the shadows. At the heart of the story were the victims, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. 5 women, all living on society's edge, poor, homeless, forgotten. To many Victorians, they were invisible long before they died. But after the Ripper, they became symbols, tragic reminders of a city that had failed its most vulnerable. For every woman who walked alone in the East End, fear was now a constant companion. Doors were bolted. Jobs were lost. And the shadow of Whitechapel's killer spread far beyond the slums. Mass hysteria. By November, London had reached its breaking point. False alarms spread like wildfire. Every cry, every scream in the night brought police running. Men carrying knives for work were nearly lynched by mobs. Rumors of Jack's next target appeared daily. Some even claimed to see him, a tall man in a black coat, a glinting knife in hand, disappearing into the mist. The police arrested dozens, interrogated hundreds, but found nothing. The killer had vanished as completely as if the fog itself had swallowed him whole. And then came the worst part of all, the silence. The silence after the storm. After Mary Jane Kelly's brutal murder on November 9, 1888, the killings suddenly stopped. No more bodies, no more letters, no more blood. The Ripper had disappeared as mysteriously as he had arrived. Some believed he had died. Others thought he had fled the country. And some whispered he was still there, watching, waiting. The silence felt unnatural. It wasn't peace, it was dread. Because no one ever caught him. No trial, no confession. No ending. Only a city left haunted by a question that would never be answered. Who was Jack the Ripper? The aftermath, a city forever changed. The Ripper's reign lasted only a few months. But its impact would echo for more than a century. The murders exposed the deep divide between London's rich and poor, and forced the government to confront the horrors of slum life. Policing changed forever, with new methods, record-keeping, and forensic thinking born from the investigation's failures. Yet, perhaps the Ripper's greatest legacy was psychological. He had proven that even in the heart of the greatest empire on earth, evil could thrive, unseen, unpunished, unstoppable. The fog that once symbolized mystery, now symbolized fear. And Whitechapel would never be the same again. The ghost in the fog years passed, the world moved on, the empire rose and fell. But the name Jack the Ripper never died. Books, films, documentaries, all trying to unmask the phantom of 1888, but the truth remains locked in those bloodstained streets. In the alleyways of Whitechapel, where the gaslight still flickers and the fog still curls like smoke from hell itself. Sometimes, if you walk those streets late at night, you might hear the echo of footsteps behind you, slow, steady, deliberate, and for a fleeting moment, you might wonder if the legend ever truly ended. The murders had ended, but the mystery had only begun. The streets of Whitechapel were still stained with fear, and though the killer's knife had gone silent, his ghost remained, a whisper in every dark alley, a shadow in every pub. The world wanted a name. They wanted to see the face of the monster who had brought London to its knees. But what if there wasn't one face? What if Jack the Ripper was not one man, but 100 theories in human form? 1. Montague John Druitt, the gentleman gone mad. The first major suspect to emerge was Montague John Druitt, a barrister, school teacher, and cricketer. By all accounts, he was well-educated, polite, and respected. But beneath that polished exterior was something darker. In December 1888, just weeks after the last Ripper murder, Druitt's body was found floating in the River Thames. A note in his pocket hinted at despair. He feared he was going mad. The timing was uncanny. The murder stopped the very month he died. Scotland Yard's Assistant Commissioner Sir Melville Macnaghten later wrote that Druitt was sexually insane and the most likely suspect. But the evidence was circumstantial, no confession, no proof, only coincidence, and yet to some it was enough. A man of privilege, hiding a monstrous secret, driven to madness by his own nature. It was a story Victorian society wanted to believe. 2. Aaron Kosminski, the mad barber of Whitechapel. Then there was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant, a poor barber who lived right in the heart of Whitechapel. He was quiet, withdrawn, but plagued by violent delusions. In 1891, he was committed to an asylum where he spent the rest of his life hearing voices and refusing to eat food not prepared by himself. Police files from the era mention a Kosminski as a prime suspect, and later reports claimed that a witness had even identified him but refused to testify. Over a century later, modern DNA tests on a shawl supposedly belonging to one of the victims claimed to link Kosminski to the crimes. The evidence was controversial, but it reignited the theory that the Ripper wasn't a gentleman or a doctor, but a madman hiding in plain sight among the poor. A local. A face no one looked at twice. Perhaps that's why he was never caught. 3. Michael Ostrog. The criminal chameleon. Next came Michael Ostrog, a Russian-born thief, conman, and master of disguise. He had a long record of fraud and violence. He used aliases, moved between countries, and was known for his unpredictable temper. Ostrog was intelligent, even charming, but ruthless when cornered. Scotland Yard listed him as a suspect, but there was one problem. Records showed he was imprisoned in France at the time of the murders. Still, the myth persisted. The idea of a foreign killer slipping through the fog with a surgeon's precision and a criminal's cunning was too tantalizing to dismiss. And in a city terrified of outsiders, Ostrog became the perfect scapegoat. 4. Dr. Thomas Neil Cream, the poisoner who knew too much. In 1892, a Scottish-born doctor named Thomas Neil Cream was hanged for poisoning multiple women. As the noose tightened around his neck, he reportedly whispered, "I am Jack the..." The trapdoor opened before he could finish. Whether he meant it or not, the legend took hold instantly. Cream had been imprisoned in Illinois during the Whitechapel murders, making his confession impossible. But conspiracy theorists suggested otherwise, that he had bribed his way out or had an accomplice. He was known for his hatred of women, his medical skill, and his calculated cruelty. A man who killed not for lust or rage, but for pleasure, cold, detached, scientific. A doctor who played God. Could he have been the Ripper before crossing the Atlantic? The evidence says no, but the possibility haunts history like a half-finished sentence. 5. Prince Albert Victor, the Royal Conspiracy. Then came the wildest theory of all, the Royal Conspiracy. Some claim that Prince Albert Victor, grandson of Queen Victoria, had been involved in scandalous affairs with women of the East End, and that the murders were part of a cover-up orchestrated by the Crown itself. In this theory, the killings weren't random acts of madness. They were assassinations, executed by royal agents to silence those who knew too much. The idea spread like wildfire, fueled by distrust of the upper class and fascination with the monarchy's secrets. But historians have since debunked it. The prince was nowhere near Whitechapel during the murders. Still, the theory persisted for one reason. People couldn't accept that such horror came from an ordinary man. So they looked upward, to palaces, not slums, hoping the truth was grander than it was gruesome. 6. The artist, the lunatic, and the unknown. Beyond the famous names, there were dozens more. The painter Walter Sickert, whose dark art seemed obsessed with death. The American quack Francis Tumblety, arrested in London and later fleeing to the US, and the nameless vagrants, lunatics, and killers who slipped through the cracks of Victorian London. Each theory had evidence, each had holes. The truth, perhaps, lies buried beneath centuries of rumor and obsession. 7. The perfect disguise. Maybe the greatest secret of all was this. Jack the Ripper's true identity was ordinary. He blended into the crowds, worked by day and hunted by night. He was not a monster from the shadows. He was a man the world never noticed. And that, perhaps, was his greatest weapon. No one ever suspected him because he looked like everyone else. He vanished not because he escaped, but because no one ever saw him. 8. The legacy of doubt. The police files have long since yellowed with age. The witnesses are dust. The evidence lost to time. And yet, the world still hunts for the face behind the fog. Books, films, investigators, all chasing the same phantom through the same misty streets. But every time we think we see him, he disappears again. Jack the Ripper isn't just a man anymore. He's an idea, the embodiment of human darkness, the proof that evil can walk beside us unseen. 9. The final truth. Perhaps we were never meant to know who he was. Because the terror of the unknown is what keeps his story alive. Every theory, every clue, every suspect, they all lead us back to the same place, the fog. Where a knife glints once in the dark, a scream echoes down a silent alley, and history itself turns away in fear. Jack the Ripper isn't gone. He's just waiting, in the pages of history, in the hearts of those who still seek him. The murder stopped, but the story never did. In the narrow alleys of Whitechapel, time moved on. The gas lamps were replaced by electric bulbs, the cobblestones paved over, and the city grew into a glittering modern empire. But beneath the hum of London's progress, the whispers never faded. The name Jack the Ripper still lingered, a ghost refusing to die. It wasn't just a case file anymore. It was a legend. A scar carved into the collective memory of the world. 1. The fear that never left even today. If you walk through Whitechapel at night, you can almost feel it. The air is heavier, the corners darker. The buildings, though changed, still hold their silence like secrets. Locals speak of an unease that never left, a feeling that something happened here. Something evil that never truly ended. The Ripper murders changed London forever. For the first time, the city realized that monsters didn't hide in forests or castles, they walked its streets. The very idea of a serial killer, a predator who killed for pleasure, who hunted strangers, was born from those foggy nights in 1888, and once born it could never be forgotten. 2. The birth of the media monster. Jack the Ripper wasn't just a killer, he was the world's first media-made murderer. In the late 19th century, newspapers were booming. Every gruesome detail sold papers. Every rumor, every theory, every bloodstained headline fed the public's hunger for fear. The press didn't just report the Ripper's story, they created it. It was the media that gave him his name, that turned him from a faceless killer into a mythic figure of evil. Jack the Ripper signed one of the letters sent to police. Real or fake, no one could say, but the name stuck, and with it, the killer became immortal. The Ripper's crimes marked the beginning of tabloid journalism, the blending of fact and sensation, truth and theater. He was both a murderer and a celebrity, an invisible man with a stage as large as the world. 3. The obsession begins after the killings ended, the obsession began. Writers, detectives, historians, all fell under the spell of the Ripper mystery. Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, once speculated that the killer might have been a woman, a midwife, covered in blood, who could walk unnoticed. Others spent decades chasing new theories. Royals, surgeons, artists, immigrants, even writers themselves. Every generation found a new suspect, a new clue, a new way to rewrite the same horror. And yet, every time the fog closed in again, the deeper they searched, the more the truth slipped away. It was as if Jack himself was mocking them, dancing just beyond the edge of the lantern light. 4. The Ripper industry. Over the years, Jack the Ripper stopped being a man and became an industry. Books, plays, films, tours, and museums, all feeding off the myth. In Whitechapel today, you can take a Ripper tour. You can buy souvenirs, stand on the very corners where his victims once screamed. It's a strange irony that the city which once trembled in terror now profits from the fear it once tried to forget. But maybe that's what happens when evil becomes legend. It stops being a warning and becomes entertainment. 5. The forgotten victims. Amidst all the theories and fame, one truth often fades. The women he killed were real: Mary and Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. Their names echo softly through history, but rarely as loud as his. They were daughters, mothers, friends, each driven by poverty into lives of hardship. The Ripper didn't just kill them, society did. A society that ignored the poor, that pushed women into dark corners, and then acted shocked when darkness found them. Their blood was a reflection of London's own sins. And perhaps that's why the city has never stopped trying to solve the case, not for justice, but for forgiveness. 6. The police and the failure. The investigation of 1888 remains one of history's greatest failures. The police were overwhelmed, untrained for such horror. No forensics, no DNA, no fingerprinting, just guesses, fear, and a city on the edge. Hundreds were questioned, dozens arrested, and yet the killer walked free. Detectives like Frederick Aberline became obsessed, haunted until their final days by the case they couldn't close. In their notes, you can feel the frustration, the sense that the answer was so close but forever out of reach. It wasn't just a failure of justice, it was the birth of modern detective work. The Ripper case forced the world to evolve, to study the mind of killers, to see murder not as madness, but as method. 7. The modern hunt. Over a century later, the hunt still goes on. Historians, criminologists, and forensic experts still chase the Ripper's shadow. DNA analysis, digital reconstructions, psychological profiling, all tools the Victorian police could only dream of, and yet, no one can say with certainty who he was. Every few years, a new theory emerges, a new final proof is announced, and every time, the fog rolls back in. It's as if the killer is still one step ahead, forever guarding his secret. 8. The symbol of evil. Jack the Ripper's true identity may never be known, but his symbolic identity is clear. He became the embodiment of a truth humanity fears to face, that evil doesn't need reason. It doesn't come with warning. It walks beside us, unseen, until it strikes. In every city, every era, his spirit finds a new face, a new name. From the serial killers of the 20th century to the dark corners of the internet today, the Ripper's legacy lives on, not in who he was, but in what he revealed about us. 9. The final night. Imagine, for a moment, a A single night in 1888. Fog curling through the alleys. A lantern swinging in the breeze. A woman's footsteps echoing down the cobblestones. She turns, he's there, no words. Just the flash of a knife, the sound of rain, and then silence. In that silence, history changed. Because that night, evil wasn't hiding anymore, it was walking the streets. And we've been chasing it ever since. 10. The endless fog today. The fog over Whitechapel is no longer real, but metaphorical. It's the fog of uncertainty, of fascination, of our endless need to find meaning in madness. Jack the Ripper's greatest trick wasn't escaping capture. It was ensuring that we would never stop looking for him. He became immortal, not through life, but through mystery. And so, the legend remains, somewhere out there in the fog of history and imagination, Jack the Ripper still walks. Not as a man, but as a reminder that the darkest corners of the human soul are never as far away as we'd like to think.